What is our root problem, our deepest problem, according to early Buddhism, according to the Buddha's teachings? That's a question I want to answer in this video. If you're new to this channel of mine and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click that bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So this question here is, what is this root problem that underlies everything that are all of our issues that we have in life? What I want to do is to describe what that root problem is, and then how to understand it. I'll let the cat out of the bag here. The root problem that we'll get to eventually is the problem of ignorance. So what I want to do here is, again, to describe first why that is the root problem according to early Buddhism, but also what ignorance is, which is, I think, quite a deep and interesting question on its own. Now, it's quite interesting to consider how it is that ignorance might be our root problem, or what that problem might be. Because if we come to Buddhism looking, for instance, at the Buddha's supposed first sermon, at the Four Noble Truths, there we find in the second noble truth that the origin of dukkha, of suffering or unsatisfactoriness, lies in craving, not in ignorance. So if we look at the beginning of the Buddha's teaching, supposed beginning, the root problem is a problem of craving. And yet, as we'll see, in really many, many places in early Buddhism, that root problem seems to have been substituted with ignorance. Now, some contemporary scholars believe that this is actually a significant shift, and that in fact, the idea of ignorance being our root problem is a later development. So that perhaps the Buddha originally began with a philosophy, a Dharma, constructed around emotion, if you like. That the problem was an emotional one of craving, of getting rid of craving. And then later on, that changed into a more cognitive kind of interpretation of the problem being one of ignorance. Now, why this would have happened is really unclear. Perhaps it happened because early Buddhism was in competition with other schools of thought at the time, and so in these arguments and these disputes, there was a necessity of becoming very cognitive about the Dharma and crossing every T and dotting every I, and so the problems ramified and got clarified and became more cognitive as time went on. Arguably could also involve the influence of Sariputta, which is the Buddha's right-hand disciple, who was considered the greatest in wisdom of his disciples. And Sariputta seemed to be very interested in just this kind of analysis and cognitive kind of understanding of the Dharma. So perhaps it was under his influence that the focus changed from craving to ignorance. It's impossible to say, and indeed it may not even be true that there was a shift. It may have been that all of this developed at once, and that, the Buddha just talked in different ways at different times. In any event, if we look at, for example, the chain of dependent origination in its most established form, the 12 links of dependent origination, we see what is perhaps the most complete description of the arising of dukkha, of the arising of suffering in our lives. And that 12-link chain originates in originates in ignorance, and also contains craving, but craving occurs at the 8th position. In other words, craving occurs somewhere in the middle of the chain, and there are 7 different links before it. So if you look at the chain of dependent origination, you're not going to say that craving is the origin of our problems, or at least it doesn't look like it is, because it's in the middle of the chain, right? So the chain doesn't originate, or doesn't appear to originate in craving at all. And as I say, the earliest step, the first link in this chain is in fact ignorance, which lends weight to its being the most important. At least, I should say the first chain is ignorance in most examples of the chain of dependent origination. There's one example of the 12-link chain of dependent origination in which it's not the first link, and we'll get to that in a moment. But in any event, in other descriptions of early Buddhism of the unskillful states of mind with which we're beset, ignorance comes up as the deepest in all of them, really. So, for example, we have the 10 fetters. The 10 fetters is one way of understanding our problems. These are 10 different states of mind, ways of being, that bind us to samsara, that bind us to a life of suffering, if you like, that bind us to unsatisfactoriness. And indeed, among these 10, there are 5 that are considered the higher fetters. That is, they're fetters, they're bonds that keep us bound until we reach enlightenment itself. They're very, very difficult to eradicate. And indeed, the last of these is said to be ignorance itself. So that in this interpretation, the one of the 10 fetters, really ignorance is the last one that we release ourselves from before we become enlightened. We also have certain what are called unskillful latent tendencies of the mind. That is, particular tendencies that we have even when we're not aware of them, even when they're not active in our minds. These are unskillful tendencies that tend to get us to do things that we shouldn't be doing. And again, the last of these latent tendencies, these unskillful tendencies of the mind, is the tendency of ignorance. In other words, it's the, we might argue, the most difficult latent tendency to get rid of. And also, and perhaps most importantly, it's the third, ignorance is the third of the 3 asavas, or asava is a word in Pali that's somewhat difficult to translate into English. I'll just use the word taints or corruptions. There are different ways of understanding it, translating it. Basically, they're very, very problematic states that are the hallmark, overcoming which is the hallmark of the attainment of enlightenment. So that when the Buddha says that he attains enlightenment, or somebody does, that they understand they've overcome these taints, these asavas. And again, the third of these, which means presumably the last, is the taint of ignorance. Now, interestingly, in his discussion of right view, Sariputta actually discusses the chain of dependent origination that we just mentioned, but when it comes to ignorance, Sariputta actually discusses there being an interrelation between ignorance on the one hand and the asavas on the other, these taints, and that they both condition each other. Now, this to me is a very obscure and confusing claim because the asavas themselves contain ignorance. And so ignorance seems to be conditioning itself in a way. How is the ignorance as the first of the first link in this chain of dependent origination different from the ignorance of the 3 asavas? It's not clear, he doesn't say, and I'm not aware of anywhere else in the early tradition that says either. Nevertheless, Sariputta's understanding here is that there is an interrelation between these taints on the one hand and ignorance itself, however we're supposed to understand that. Okay, so I think we've established here a little bit that in the early tradition, ignorance seems to be our deepest problem. If we look at all of these problematic lists of, or I should say lists of problematic states, ignorance is in all of them. It's the last of them to go away. It's the earliest stage in the chain of dependent origination, or at least it's one of the early stages. All of these suggest the same thing, which is its centrality. But then what is ignorance? Now, you might say it's pretty obvious. Ignorance is a lack of knowledge. That's what it means. Literally in English, the word ignorance means lack of knowledge. However, a number of scholars have pointed out that there are problems with understanding ignorance in that sense. There's a recent paper by, or not recent, but an earlier paper by a very great scholar of early Indian philosophy named B.K. Matilal, who writes that there are problems understanding how a lack of knowledge can be a causal force. After all, ignorance is supposed to be the first stage in this chain of dependent origination. It's supposed to condition the later stages. In particular, it's supposed to condition our tendency for acting in certain karmically important ways. But how is a lack of knowledge, a lack of anything, supposed to have causal impact? This may seem a kind of an obscure problem, but it is a problem that was taken up in the later Abhidharma, where concerns like this became somewhat paramount. The second problem is that if we understand ignorance, the Pali word is avidyā, if we're to understand avidyā as simply a lack of knowledge, then it would seem as though to become enlightened, to overcome ignorance, we have to be omniscient. In other words, we have to know everything. Because, for example, if the problem is a lack of knowledge, and we become enlightened but don't know everything, then we still lack knowledge. We're still ignorant. So that's a problem, right? And that would imply that anybody who becomes enlightened is therefore omniscient as a result. And that's not the case in Buddhism. It's indeed, I've done an earlier video on the argument that the Buddha himself claimed not to be omniscient in any important sense, in other words, knowing everything all the time. So if avidyā is perhaps not best understood as a complete lack of knowledge, then how are we supposed to understand it? Well, one way to get at this problem is to look at a couple of early suttas where ignorance or avidyā is described. In one place it says, "An ignoramus sunk in ignorance gives rise to wrong view. Wrong view gives rise to wrong intention. Wrong intention gives rise to wrong speech. Wrong speech gives rise to wrong action. Wrong action gives rise to wrong livelihood. Wrong livelihood gives rise to wrong effort. Wrong effort gives rise to wrong mindfulness. Wrong mindfulness gives rise to wrong concentration." And here we can see that ignorance is sort of tied up in wrong views. That is to say that somebody who we might say is terribly confused has wrong views and so has therefore a wrong grasp of the entire path of practice. So we might say that somebody who is terribly confused perhaps doesn't think there's a difference between right and wrong, doesn't understand that difference, and so begins life with a whole lot of greed and hatred and thinks that they are perfectly unproblematic, and so, let's say, yells at people, steals things, indulges in wrong livelihood, and as a result is unable to meditate properly because their mind is always stirred up and they've always got regrets of various kinds. They're not able to come to any kind of wise understanding. That's kind of the view we have here of somebody who is caught up in ignorance. In another sutta he says, or rather, the monastic asks the Buddha, "What is ignorance? And how is an ignorant person defined?" And the Buddha responds, "Not knowing about suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering. This is called ignorance, and this is how an ignorant person is defined." So as we can see here, avidyā or ignorance isn't a general lack of knowledge about things in general. That's not really important. What it is a lack of knowledge about specific, very important things. That is, in particular, about the Four Noble Truths themselves, or perhaps we might say about the chain of dependent origination, which, if we understand it, is really an elaboration on the first two of those Noble Truths. Now, the scholar B.K. Matilal, who I mentioned before, argues that therefore avidyā, or we might term ignorance, is best understood basically as improper, incorrect knowledge that passes for truth. In other words, as misconception, we might say. That's probably a better way to put it. So avidyā is sort of more closely related to misconception. And here we can think of a place where the Buddha talks about 4 of what he termed inversions of perception. So the Buddha talks in another sutta about 4 ways that we can misperceive, or we tend to misperceive the world. We tend to misperceive the impermanent as permanent. We tend to misperceive suffering as happiness. We tend to misperceive what is non-self, what is not ourselves, as self. And we tend to misperceive the non-beautiful as beautiful. In all of these cases, these misperceptions lead us astray. They're examples, indeed, of ignorance. And we might say they're paradigms of ignorance. They're misconceptions that lead us down the wrong path. So it's not simply or literally that we lack knowledge in this case about permanence, about suffering, about the self, or about happiness. It's not that, or I should say beauty, it's not that we literally lack knowledge of these things, it's that we think we know about them, but we're wrong. We're continually mistaken. We're misconceiving the world in certain ways. We have views about the way things are that are incorrect. And these lead us down the wrong path and lead to suffering. So, for example, if we think of the impermanent as permanent, as so many of us do so much of the time, myself included, I have to say, then we're liable to grasp at it. We're liable to give it much more importance in our lives than it really ought to have. And when the impermanent thing decays and falls apart, as it inevitably will, then we suffer as a response or as a result. And if we mistake suffering for happiness, then again, we're liable, in fact, to pursue something which we think is going to make us happy, but in fact makes us suffer. There are many people who, at least on the face of it, seem to think of anger or being enraged as a form of happiness, that they think that being angry makes them happy. I think you see people like this on certain kinds of news broadcasts regularly, who indulge in anger and hatred on a regular basis in a way that they seem to think is going to make them or somebody else happy. And of course we know, any of us who've done any meditation on this will realize that that is a form of ignorance, that in fact being enraged, being angry is suffering. It's the farthest thing from happiness, and to pursue it is simply to pursue our own suffering. So ignorance in this sense is a kind of a misconception of the noble truths. So for example, the first noble truth is the noble truth of suffering. I did videos about the noble truths. If you want to see those videos, I'll leave links to the first of them down below, and it'll show you the other ones as well if you go there. But in any event, the first noble truth is the noble truth of of suffering itself, of getting to know suffering. And many people think that they know suffering. That is, they may think, that not to have the wherewithal to afford the most expensive luxuries is a form of suffering. That's a misconception. They may think that having enemies who are prospering is a form of suffering. And that also is a misconception. And both of these are examples, I think, of the ways that ordinary people think of what real suffering is and think that they've understood it, but in fact they have not. And similarly, we might say that the second noble truth is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. And some people may think that their suffering originates from the fact that, let's say, their enemies are not doing badly, and therefore, if they were to harm their enemies, if they were to lash out, that they would undercut their own suffering. Well, this is another example of a delusion. And these are ways that we can see ignorance is better understood as misconception than as simple lack of knowledge. Underlying all of this, of course, is the question of what real happiness is. If we oftentimes mistake suffering for happiness, what is happiness? How are we going to get there? And I did an earlier video on that very topic, on how to understand happiness from within an early Buddhist context, and I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen if you haven't seen it, or if you want to see it again. Thanks so much to all of my patrons over on Patreon. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one. Meanwhile, all of you, be well.